Hey everyone, in today's video we are going to directly compare the brand new Intel iGPU, the so-called Intel Arc B390 12xe within an Intel Core Ultra X9 388H, for which I used an ASUS ZENBOOK Duo with 32GB of LPDDR5X 9600 MT/s RAM. And to see if it would be a good APU for gaming handhelds, today we're going to compare it against the Z2 Extreme in the ASUS ROG Xbox LIX with 24GB of LPDDR5 7500 MT/s RAM, both at 17W and 35W in a couple of games. Before we're taking a closer look at the benchmarks, I wanted to show you the efficiency graphs for both devices first, for which I once again used Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 720p and high settings and tested both devices at all possible wattages. In this scenario, the new Intel Arc B390 is faster in all TDPs, while especially at the lower wattages they are quite close. And later you'll see in the actual gaming benchmarks, in some games the Z2 Extreme is faster at these lower wattages, not in Shadow of the Tomb Raider though. At around 20 to 22 watt, the B390 is really taken off and running away, right up to around 35 watt, after which we are not seeing many improvements. In some games, you're even not seeing any additional FPS after 35W for the B390, while for the Z2 Extreme, we're not getting a lot of performance gains once we reach around 22W. And coincidentally, 35W is the maximum TDP we can set for the Z2 Extreme in the Xbox LIX. Also, a quick look at the efficiency curves in terms of FPS per watt. We can see both CPUs have their highest efficiency around 13 to 20W, specifically 20W for the B390 and 14 to 15W for the Z2 Extreme. And after around 20W, we're getting less and less FPS per watt, while overall the B390 has quite a noticeably higher efficiency, well, as it's just obviously pumping out more FPS, at least in this scenario, which again is not the case in all real gaming scenarios as mentioned before, and we'll see that in a bit. At this point, a quick shout out to the Fox, which stated that for the B390 you'll have to set the PL2 slightly higher than the PL1, even if it's only 1 watt and only for 1 second, because only then we'll get the maximum performance right now. I know it doesn't make sense, but it really is that way, and I double and triple check that. Starting with Assassin's Creed Shadows, using the low preset with FSR on performance at 1080p to get somewhat playable FPS, we're getting 34 FPS for both CPUs in that scenario at 17W, while for whatever reason the VRAM usage on the Intel system seems to be a lot higher. However, both CPUs are about as fast in this scenario, so let's have a look at 35W next. Here the Z2 Extreme and its Radeon 890M only gain an additional 10 FPS on average, leading to an average of 44 FPS, while the Intel Arc B390 can achieve 52 FPS in total, which is 18% more in comparison with the Z2 Extreme. So quite the difference here, that's already noticeable. And of course the 1% lows also benefit from that. Again, the Intel system is using much more RAM, but of course the ASUS laptop does have 32GB of RAM, while the ASUS gaming handheld only has 24GB of RAM, so that's not going to use the RAM in the same way exactly. For Alan Wake 2 I was using the low preset once again with FSR on quality, this time at 1080p, and using the 17W profiles, the Z2 Extreme with the Radeon 890M actually was 14% faster, which in this case is 4 FPS, 32 FPS over 28 FPS on average. And stuff like this really depends on the game and how well it is optimized. Also, we have to factor in that the Intel chip is very new and the drivers probably are still very early. And there will of course be lots of optimization for the drivers by Intel in the future. However, using 35W with the same settings, the tables really have turned, and now the Intel Arc B390 12xe is 21% faster. We're now seeing only 42 FPS for the Z2 Extreme with the Radeon 890M versus 51 FPS on average for the Intel chip. And once again, we can see drastic differences in the RAM usage. This time the VRAM seems to be about the same, but the total system memory the chips use are vastly different. For Baldurs Gate 3 I was using the medium preset using the DirectX 11 API with FSR2 on quality at 1080p. And in this test sequence both chips seem to have the same average FPS. The Z2 Extreme does have a super small lead, but you've probably already noticed it. The 1% lows are really terrible for the Intel Arc B390. In this scenario, 14 FPS only versus 24 FPS for the Z2 Extreme. Probably a driver issue thing, I don't know, we'll have to see in the future. Using 35 watt instead, the 1% lows for the Intel Arc B390 have been a lot better, still a bit worse than the Z2 in comparison, but overall the average is quite higher for the Intel Arc B390 here with 53 FPS on average over only 42 FPS on average, which is an advantage of 26% here. And again, that is noticeable. Next up was Cyberpunk 2077 using the medium preset plus FSR on quality at 1080p. And once again, we start with the 17 watt profiles. Both chips just managed to get an average of 40 FPS in this case. While once again, as you can see, the RAM usage is vastly different. While interestingly, the Z2 Extreme does seem to use more VRAM in this scenario, at least a bit. Other than that, we're getting exactly the same 40 FPS for both chips. Now using the 35 watt TDP profiles, the Intel Arc B390 at 12xe is taking a big lead here with 76 FPS over 53 FPS. A very big difference of 43%, and that is very noticeable. And depending on the settings, that could for some people make the difference between playable and unplayable if you're getting less FPS with maybe higher settings or a higher resolution. In CS2 with the lowest settings and FSR activated at 1080p, I actually saw the biggest difference in terms of a lead for the Intel Arc B390 using the 17 watt profile with an average of 140 FPS over 120 FPS using this benchmark map. That's a difference of 17% here, and even in this game the RAM usage is vastly different for both systems. And when I was testing the chips with 35 watt instead, the Intel is really taking a huge lead here with 100 FPS more. So we're getting 141 FPS versus 241 FPS. That's a big lead of 71%, but we have to factor in that the Intel Arc B390 does have insane good single core performance, and CS2 is really a game that doesn't need a lot of cores, but it really depends on how strong a single core is. Here we can also see that the Z2 is really held back by its CPU. You can see that if you take a look at the GPU utilization, which is not even close to 99%, which means that the GPU is kinda bored and has to wait for the CPU to push out more FPS. In Diablo 4, using the medium settings with FSR on quality at 1080p, using the 17 watt profile, the Z2 Extreme with the Radeon 890M is once again taking a small lead with an average of 59 FPS over 55 FPS, a small difference of 7%. However, that way the game is very playable on both chips here. And again, as seen before, using 35 watts instead, the tables have turned, and now the Intel Arc B390 can push out insanely high 101 FPS in comparison to the 66 FPS for the Z2 Extreme, and that is a pretty big difference of 53% this time. While once more the Intel system is using, or at least reserving, about twice as much RAM. Far Cry 6 is heavily AMD optimized, and that really shows in this case. We're getting an average of 50 FPS over 42 FPS for the 17 watt profile when we're using the medium settings at 1080p. And as you can see here, the Intel chip does have huge problems with the 1% lows. The frame time graph is all over the place, and I would say it is not really playable at this point, at least. And I think this was the only game where the Z2 Extreme even was faster using the 35 watt profile compared to the Intel Arc B390, which again is probably caused by driver issues and the fact that this game is just optimized for AMD GPUs and CPUs. Testing Forza Horizon 5 with the high settings preset NMSAA by 2 at 1080p, and at 35 watt the AMD Z2 Extreme got an average of 73 FPS, while the Intel Arc B390 12xe is quite faster here with an average of 95 FPS, and that's a pretty noticeable difference of 30% here. But it is of course playable just perfectly fine on both APUs. For Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, I was using the low preset with FSR on balance to get somewhat playable FPS at 1080p, and we get an average of 43 FPS for the Z2 Extreme and an average of only slightly better 47 FPS, which is only a difference of 9% for the Intel Arc B390 here. Probably driver issues. It could get some optimization in the future, though the frame time graph seemed a little bit flatter for the Intel chip. Having 32 GB of RAM most certainly helps here, because this game, even at low settings, it just eats 8 GB or even more than 8 GB of VRAM. And Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is really enjoyable at medium settings on the Intel Arc B390 12xe with FSR on quality at 1080p, because here we are finally getting an average of above 60 FPS, 63 FPS, and that's 37% faster than on the Z2 Extreme in the Xbox LIX here at 35 watt. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I was using the medium preset plus TAA at 1080p, and at 70 watt both chips kind of perform the same with an average of 44 FPS. And that's not exactly the same result as you have seen in my efficiency graph in the beginning, which is because for that I was using 720p in high settings, so we're obviously seeing a difference here depending on which setting we use. But for the 35 watt profile or for the 35 watt TDP setting, we are now seeing a difference of 16% with an average of 50 and 58 FPS for the Intel Arc B390, also using the medium settings plus TAA at 1080p. No upscaling was activated here. Though you've probably noticed it because it's pretty obvious, the frame time graph for the Intel chip seems a bit off. This is most certainly again a driver issue. I was also testing The Last of Us Part 2 with medium settings and FSR on balanced at 1080p, and that's even playable using 17 watt only. For the Z2 Extreme, that resulted in an average of 36 FPS, which is actually 9% faster than the average of 33 FPS for the Intel Arc B390 chip here. Once again, the Z2 Extreme is very well optimized for 17 watt, which is because it's a dedicated handheld chip. We won't find this one in other devices other than handhelds. And of course, you'll get much better battery run times with 17 watt only compared to 35 watt. And once again, at 35 watt, the tables turn drastically. In this case, we are seeing now an average of 43 FPS for the Z2 Extreme. That's not much better than on the 17 watt profile, and already an average of 60 FPS on the Intel Arc B390, an advantage of 40%, which is pretty big once again. And I mean, 60 FPS is usually what you'd want for a single player title. So I really think that one could argue if you could already call this a gaming chip, like at least a entry-level gaming chip. And last but not least, let's also have a quick look at The Witcher 3 using medium settings, also using the old DirectX 11 mode at 1080p. And at 17 watt, we're already seeing pretty good averages here, 50 FPS for the Z2 Extreme and slightly better 54 FPS for the Intel Arc B390, a difference of 8%. However, at 35 watt, the Intel Arc B390 is really destroying the Z2 Extreme here with 96 over 57 FPS, a huge difference of 68%. And such a high average FPS is really great for the Intel chip. And in my previous video, I've actually tested this game at 1440p, which is still playable on the Intel Arc B390. So check that out next if you're interested. So if we're taking a look at the average FPS over all the games, at 17 watt, it's basically a draw, because in some games the Intel Arc B390 is faster, and in others the AMD Radeon Z2 Extreme and the 890M are faster. However, at 35 watt, if we let the Intel Arc B390 run as intended, it can really run away with an average advantage of 38%, which is quite noticeable. In some games it's even more than that, in some it's not as much, but it's clearly a much faster APU. And in my next video I'm going to compare this against the GPD Win 5 with the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 and the Radeon 8060S. So make sure to subscribe to the channel so you're not going to miss that. And I'm planning to do this around next week if possible. And that's already all for today. If you enjoyed the content, please don't forget to like the video and or subscribe to the channel, because these kind of videos, they take quite a lot of time to make. Also, thanks for watching once again until the very end if you're still here. See you next time. Bye bye and tschüss.